Hello, hello, and welcome to another little video, which is basically inspired by a couple of suggestions received as a bit of a thank you for it being the 50th live today, which is going to look at and sort of a continuation again from the 4,000 subscribers thank you video, but which is a bit of a different topic because this is a history channel, and normally I do focus on history. But actually, there is a surprisingly large amount of history in this, and it is relevant. So, if you don't mind extending me a little bit of a boon, I will tell you some history and guide you through a little bit of information. The what, the why, and how of armed forces, and in particular, maritime and naval forces. Now, I'm not going to get into a sort of campaigning video. Some people have asked me to do that, explain why we need a navy, why we need a Royal Marines, and that is probably actually going to be covered by this. But I'm not going to do a campaigning video because that isn't again what the channel is about. It's naval history, and hopefully the lessons of naval history that can be used and can guide for better decisions to be made in the future than were necessarily made in the past. Leaving that all to one side, though, there is some particularly quite recent history which is covered in this. And it's interesting stuff because I made a point the other day, and you're going to see when it comes up. And people went, "What?" It was in bilge pumps I made the point. I'm not sure if it's come up yet, but it's in the sort of discussions which have come after it. It certainly has come up. And so I thought it would be relevant to discuss it. So, anyway. Bilge pumps, of course. If you want an up-to-date, well, sort of, usually about a week behind, topical, as much humour as we can do, and as much sort of, how to put it, low stress, enjoyable approach to what is going on in naval and maritime affairs, please do go and listen to Bilge Pumps. We're certainly not shock jocks or anything like that. We are three naval geeks having a long chat, and we just decided to start recording them basically. And it's a lot of fun. And we hope you like listening. Cinesec certainly thinks so. Right, so the criteria used, just in case you feel like putting your own thoughts together. There is no point trying and pretend certain new areas of technology don't exist and don't have a factor. They do. The difference is depending on whether you take new technology and you say that completely erases the old stuff or the old capabilities and we no longer need those, or whether you don't. The experience and lessons of history would be strongly suggest that new technologies and new scopes for warfare do not erase previous ones. They continue to matter. You just have to start paying attention to them. So tanks did not erase infantry. Aircraft carriers did not erase surface ships. Submarines did not erase surface ships. Nuclear weapons did not erase surface ships or air bases. There are still reasons for having these things often, and we're going to work through that. I've left up the criteria from the Dream Fleet there, which I realise might be a bit distracting when I'm doing serious work, but as this comes from the Dream Fleet, and I did do quite a bit in there where I was explaining why you needed certain things and what certain things are for, I see this as building on from that. Hence, I've left the link in. I have no idea how long this is going to end up either, so just wish me luck, and hopefully it'll be the 35 minutes. Right, so what are armed forces? Well, there's a definition: the combined military, naval, and air forces of a nation. It's a lovely phrase. And we've got the modern domains of cyber, air, land, sea, space. Some people have added in information as well as a domain now. See, the thing is, I'd say propaganda has always been around, but I'd say it's not. that information is taking what is existing and expanding it even more. I think the trouble is information warfare fits in all of those five for me. So rather than seeing it as a separate domain, I see it as a vibrant part of all the domains. And I think actually, if you start taking information off as a separate domain, you end up in trouble because you take it out from the point where it needs to be. When I'm explaining defense to people, I often use the example of a homeowner. Nation as your home. Okay, it's very simple, and I know there are many flaws with it as a concept, but just run with it. You pay taxes, well, most of us do. And those taxes go towards supporting the police, the fire service, the ambulance services. But we still also pay for insurance. Now, the fire service, police service, etc., they're there when we get into trouble. They are there when we need to be taken to hospital, when we're burgled or whatever happens, or if there's a fire. In my area, it always seems to be the fire service who are coming out more often than anyone else. But that's usually because we have a large number of bridle paths and people like to smoke in them. Leaving that to one side, that is what they're there for, and that's what you pay your taxes for. But just because you pay your taxes doesn't mean you don't pay insurance as well. And insurance is your system, which you have them. So if something does go wrong, really wrong, you have another layer of protection, another layer of security, another blanket, another safety net, because it's sensible to, because a house, because its contents are a very big expense, because your car is a very big expense and can do a lot of damage. So it makes sense to have insurance. That doesn't mean you don't pay taxes. You have the both combined. So you have both to make your life safer, to make problems be more solvable should they occur. Well, the armed forces are a nation's emergency services. Okay, when you have a disaster happens, that's you call in the armed forces. When you have a war happens, you call in the armed forces. When someone's interfering with your interests around the world, you call in the armed forces. And when that won't be enough, when you need the extra, that's your insurance policy, that's your alliances. But the difference is with your armed forces and your alliances as your insurance policy, your insurance policy only works as long as you're actually paying for your armed forces. Because why should America, why should France, why should any of your allies, why should even Britain go to an ally's help who can't help themselves? There is the old saying, Lord helps most those who help themselves. Or hopes best those who help themselves. I'm never quite sure about that as a 100% concept, but certainly it is in terms of alliances. The reason America usually gets quite a lot of allies to come along and back it up whenever it does things is because America will more often not turn up with a lot of support and a lot of equipment and a lot of people if you get into trouble. It's how alliances work. They are, in the nicest way, transactional. You can probably help me, and therefore I will help you if you need help. Because if I'm in trouble, you can come and help me. So that's actually where you get the idea of punching above your weight from and all these things. The reason one of the principal reasons Britain procured aircraft carriers was because we're one of the few nations which actually has the industrial technological ability to do so. Many of our allies might not. So it gives us an edge if we're turning up with a task force to assist allies. We're bringing a capability that they might well not have. And actually even goes the other way. It assists America because America might have a lot more carriers than Britain does, but America has a lot of calls on its carriers around the world. So having an ally who has their own carriers becomes an advantageous scenario and allows that ally to go, we're useful to you. If you were in trouble, can you come help us? Most likely will do. Now we're getting to it. It's not always so cold. There is history, culture, and all sorts of other connections as well, which go into alliances and make them work. And there's also turning up to train and actually doing the stuff alongside it. But at their base point, alliances are not about protecting the weak from the strong. They're about the mediums clubbing together to protect themselves from the stronger and the potential of problems. And if you're not able to sort of contribute enough to that club, don't expect to get the support of that club. And that the amount you have to contribute does depend, is proportional to your size. But again, in the case of Britain, Britain is not a small nation. It is one of the world's leading economies. It is one of the most populous nations in Europe. It is one of the most interconnected, trade-wise, globally nations in the world. These things all add up. In other words, you're probably going to need to call on your allies a lot because of this, so you need to be prepared to give a lot. Why have armed forces? Okay. I'm a naval historian. I therefore could be said to make my living from war. I see it as making my living from passing on the lessons of a particular area of war and a particular area of history, so that those mistakes aren't repeated again, because they tend to be learnt at the cost of lives as well as money. And let's be honest, the lives matter more. But we still have conflicts. In an ideal world, we wouldn't have wars. In an ideal world, the universe would be peaceful and there would be no need for militaries, and it would just be an interesting area of history you get to study. In an ideal world. I might wish for an ideal world, but I know we don't live in it. I fall in the realism school of international relations, if I have to pick one. And that means the world sometimes goes to pot. Sometimes something happens. Sometimes it's an accident, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes, as I put there, it's people being shits. Excuse the French. It just happens. There are some weird and nasty people in this world, unfortunately. There are also some incredibly good people. And in a way, that sort of balances things out. But the trouble is, in my experience, the incredibly good people tend to not end up leading countries. Because incredibly good people tend to not be that power hungry. It's annoying. So that is why you have armed forces, because it's your emergency services for when that happens. And you have a lot of interests as a nation you have to protect. You have your trade. Consider the case of Britain. This can cover preservations of rules and norms around the world. Why does that matter? Because our system depends upon global trade. Our economy depends upon global trade. So if someone starts arbitrarily rewriting the existing rules, odds are they'll be rewriting them in their favor, and that would cause us economic issues. Because at the moment, most of them are written quite nicely, and broadly speaking, in our favor. Well, broadly speaking, in the more powerful nation's favors. Sorry. It's what several hundred years of history does to the world. Freedom of movement. That's one of the rules, norms. But as you saw recently in the Straits of Hormuz, if you're watching, that can be affected. Britain can have issues. And in nicest way, that was a classic case of a government making a decision to act, but not having enough of forces available in operation as normal to be able to prepare for have a force increase in that area for when it acted. So it had to rapidly deploy, which was a great example of how good the armed forces were in Britain, because there was rapid deployment of force there. And thankfully, that was enough, and not more had to be deployed. More could have been deployed if it needed to be. But the thing was, what was deployed turned out to be enough. But still, the better thing would be to have enough running in a go that you could have had something going out there before you even needed to rush it out there. So you didn't have to wait to see what the response was. So you could be preempting and calming the response. History. Alliances of paper or culture. In the nicest way, the odds are if, I don't know, random Philippines invaded Australia or something like that, the British would show up because Australia is one of our oldest pals. We used to rule them, they used to be part of the empire, but after 2 world wars of them being very selfless and fighting alongside us, we kind of owe them. But that means if we're going to show up in that scenario, we need to be able to show up capable of actually doing something. It's the same if America invaded Canada. We would probably do more than send nice words. Because the trouble is, nice words work. Harsh words work when there's sufficient force behind them. We have often talked about, if you listen to academics talking about this, about the age of the last 20, 30 years, where the strongly worded note has had a major impact. And it got to a point where people believed all you needed was the strongly worded note, but they forgot that it was rather like the 1920s and the 1930s and the 1890s and the 1880s. In that period, there was an overwhelming power, which, if it signed and backed up that strongly worded note, you did it because you didn't want to end up in a fight. You just didn't want to go there, so you listened. Because again, the people who start wars, the people who do these things, don't tend to be the most rational people. They tend to have got themselves locked into a particular train of thought, and it happens. And unfortunately, they happen to be leaders of nation states when it does, with their own armed forces. And that is the problem. And then there are geography, territory, and proximity. Okay, so the Falkland Islands, classic case. We'd hope never to have to do it again. We really do. But you have to prepare just in case, because it's actually cheaper to deter than it is to actually fight the battle. But if you do have to fight battle, you have to have the capability to fight the battle, because that is actually the best deterrent. One of the key reasons for the Falklands War was because Argentina didn't believe Britain had the interest, because of the mixed signals coming from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and various parts of the government, and didn't have the capability, because it was getting rid of Fearless and Intrepid, its amphibious ships, its major landing ships, to actually do it. And it thought the baby carriers were fine. It also thought we had a woman prime minister, so we wouldn't do anything because she's a woman. So some classic sexism going on there, and a few other issues. But we'll leave that to one side. They were wrong, but it was far more costly than it could have been if the British government prior to that, and several governments prior to that, had been far clearer in their messaging and far more open in their public support for the Falklands. But they weren't going to be, because they were muddled and not paying any attention, because they were distracted by other things. A great big Cold War with a superpower being the primary one. I don't know. Nuclear weapons cause so much trouble. Anyway, moving on from that side. Right. The reality of Britain in 2020, and you'll recognise this slide from one of my previous PowerPoints, and I realise all of these are slightly out of date. The trade has actually, the red lines have got thicker. The one from The Guardian, the lovely green money sort of tree, has also got more money, and we actually have more deployments than that. But still, it serves to illustrate the point. And for all those red lines, of trade. You could also add in red lines of data cables. Undersea data accounts for 99% of our data transfer. Think about it. How many of the programs and systems you use are run from servers and data farms which are in other countries, perhaps even in America or Australia, other side of the world? All this coming undersea. 99% of data goes under the sea. That's a very big, very scary problem you have to deal with when you've got nations which are openly contemplating mucking around those cables. And before you think it hasn't got precedent, well, I'm British. In the First World War and in the Second World War, the British cut the cables. No remorse. We set the precedent. We did it because we were fighting Kaiser Wilhelm and then Hitler's Germany. But we still set the precedent. And that is the trouble with international relations and the rule of maritime law, in that most of it hasn't been written yet, and certainly not written down, and the vast majority of it is set in precedent. So that's what you have to deal with. It's precedent. So the hows. This is my big point, and if you don't mind, I'm going to disappear my video for a second, and I'm going to expand this to far bigger, because I want you to consider this. So, since 1992, there have been 6 Prime Ministers, 14 Secretary of State for Defence, 11 Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, and 16 Ministers for the Armed Forces. Since 2005, May, there have been 4 Prime Ministers, 9 Secretaries of State for Defence, 8 Secretaries of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, and 10 Ministers for the Armed Forces. That's covering the operation of the armed forces. So if ever it's said that the armed forces operation looks a little bit muddled, there is a reason for that. I could have gone into the chiefs of staff and all these things and their changeovers, but honestly, it comes from the political heads. Okay? There are civil servants, there are generals, there are admirals, there are all these people involved, but it is very difficult to run coherent operations if you keep having a new minister every few months. And the average is that the Secretary of State for Defence, since in the last 28 years, just a little over 2 years in post. But since 2005, the last 15 years, that's gone down to less than 2 years in post, on average. What's disturbing is that the Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs Secretary of State has also gone down to less than 2 years, from what was a little over 2.5 years. This means ministers don't really know their posts. They don't know that as well as they should do. You're taking an elected official, and yes, they should always be elected officials. I am fully supportive of that. But I think it needs to start being a policy when you've got multi-year programs going in place. We're talking about accountability, and yet the people at the top, the people who are most directly accountable to the public, change over quite so regularly. Yes, they serve at the pleasure of the Prime Minister, and yes, there have been 6 Prime Ministers in that time, or 4 Prime Ministers in that time. But the question is, are the Prime Ministers directly running all the foreign and the foreign affairs, all of the defence procurement, all of defence operations? If they're not, then their ministers are taking on a lot of the day-to-day burden, and how qualified in terms of time and post are those ministers? Yes, there's going to be a learning period, but the average minister is considered really. You have to, if you look back at the most successful foreign secretaries and the most successful defense secretaries in terms of getting a clear and coherent defense vision put across for the nation in the last 20 odd years, those are all the ministers who've managed to serve more than 2 years in post. Because it's taken time to get familiar with what is a very complicated, very technical, but also very human organizations. If we consider procurement, the Queen Elizabeth programme officially kicks off in 1996 with a joint Anglo-French study programme-ish. It's then kicked into high gear in 1998. And then for all the issues of various governments, some governments paying for it not for the ships not to be built and actually paying the sum which would have bought a third aircraft carrier, if by some accounting measures, if you're working it out, they are finally commissioned 21 and 23 years later. In that time, the Ministers of Defence Procurement has changed its name to the Minister for Defence Equipment and Supply, and back to the Minister for Defence Procurement, and there have been 12 of them since 2005, 18 since 1992. That's not even the Secretary of State for Defence, that is the Minister for Defence Procurement, has changed 18 times. It's gone down 12 times since 2005. It's gone down from an average length of service just shy of 19 months to an average length of service just over 15 months. I.e., if you're made Minister for Defence and Procurement, the odds are, once you have been in the post for 1 year and 3 months, you should start getting ready to pack your bags, because you're not going to be there much longer. And what's even worse is some ministers have been there far shorter than this. There are some who've been longer. The ones over 2 years have been, and those have usually been the better ministers. But the trouble is, in between them, there have been some ministers who've been there for nanoseconds. And every time a new minister comes in, every time you get a new minister, every time you get a new hand on the tiller, things change. Because ministers want to show their input, they want to show their involvement, because they need to, because they're politicians and they need to be re-elected. So they need to show they're actually doing a job. That might explain the name change for the Minister for Defence Procurement. I'm not sure. But this isn't going to breed consistency. This isn't going to breed long-term. You've got a program which is going to take over 20, nearly 30 years to deliver. And in that time, it's had so many different people in charge. Who's responsible? One of the issues that keeps coming up is people go, the Ministry of Defence has no accountability. How can there be accountability if the person who is the actual minister, the Secretary of State, the actual person elected to Parliament as a member of Parliament by a constituency and chosen by the Prime Minister to run that ministry changes over so often, I'm surprised they've even got the curtain order in for the new curtains by the time they're replaced. These are multi-billion pound programs. In that time, in the same time since April 1992, there have been 11 health secretaries. The chancellors have been far, far fewer, the ones running the Treasury. In fact, chancellors change almost as infrequently as prime ministers in comparison. There are often comments made about the power of the Treasury when it comes to defence, when it comes to health service, when it comes to any department. I think one of the things which is constantly misunderstood and misrepresented and forgotten is the biggest power of the Treasury is that once you get your Chancellor, the odds are that Chancellor is going to be in post for as long as that Prime Minister is there. Yes, there are occasional changes, but they are far rarer than any other department. In any other department, you need to plan for losing your Secretary of State anytime they feel like a reshuffle. And that's a problem when you've got multi-year, multi-billion-pound programs. There's people talk about moving the stuff to the Defense Select Committee or all sorts of different options. Honestly, I don't see that as a viable option. It's got to stay with the people who are organizing the budget. Unless you give the budgetary making power to to Parliament, it's got to stay with the government because the government are the ones deciding how much money to spend. But I do think one of the systems which would be good, if they could do it, would be to make it a standard that secretaries of state and the ministers of state, especially in what are major critical departments, and you can decide which of those major critical departments, but I would say pick the top. So the prime minister still has the power of shuffling around because I know how important it is to the prime minister to be able to do that, show they're powerful in their party. It's all patronage and it's all the informal system which our constitutions, well, our uncodified constitution in the UK runs on. Then pick the top 6 posts, top 6 secretaries of state. We have an order of succession, we have seniority, we know which are the big spending departments, and say, right, there is now a rule. You'll have to be in post at least 2.5 years, preferably 3, minimum. And the Prime Minister can only get rid of you if it's agreed by the by the appropriate select committee. And I know it's adopting it from the American system, but honestly, it never used to be this way. Ministers did used to serve more time in post, and that was in a period when the pace of life was slower in a sort of nicest way, when you didn't have to deal with cyber warfare, space warfare, air warfare, land warfare, sea warfare. We didn't have information warfare going on in all of those. When the world was slightly, let's say, more manageable, but actually it was just as hectic, just as problematic, but it was perhaps slightly more confined even in its methodologies. The joy of technology is it brings more options for an enemy, not less. The fact that the United Kingdom has actually managed to procure the Queen Elizabeth programme as well as it has, including ministers at one point deciding to reverse everything and go with Catabar because catapults and barriers to discovery, as you've got on the American carriers of the Ford and Nimitz class, is the best in the world. Bearing in mind, it's the best, most perfect system for aviation, but doesn't really suit Britain as the best. Added even more fun to our carrier program. But that is a classic example of new ministers coming in and wanting to change things, wanting to make sure they are putting their stamp and delivering stuff. Far better scenario would be if someone had delivered 3 LHDs to replace Albion, Bulwark, and Ocean. But we'll leave that to another argument on another day. So what is the naval role in all of this? Well, here's a little analogy. If we are comparing them to emergency services, the armed forces, the army are the fire service. There are going to be some soldiers who love that one. The Air Force are the ambulance service. There are going to be some Air Force personnel who really probably actually do like that one as well. Because again, I was going for speed. The Foreign Office are probably going to hate me for telling them that they are now they are the social workers of the United Kingdom that we send out around the world, but that is social work. In my experience, when I've run up against people who do it, and especially good people, is about communication. It's about talking. It's about finding common ground and developing, and that is what a good diplomat does. In fact, often I thought that the diplomatic skills of a social worker would have been very good, are being sorely missed in the diplomatic service, but they are doing what they want to do, and they are doing it very well. So, and again, I have met diplomats who I thought, well, if they need a second career, that they would make an excellent social worker. They care for people, and they want to talk and communicate with them, and that's a good thing. It makes the naval service Navy to police, though. Now, I know there's all the things going on about defunding the police and all these things, and honestly, I see most of the while some people have jumped on that campaign, most of the campaign I see about it being is more about producing a police which is kind of like on the British model, as I understand it, where we have more integration of social workers and these things. But, my American viewers can explain that more to me. I've been finishing off my book, so some of these things have skipped past me. But I do see the naval service as kind of like a place. You've got the Royal Marines, your riot squad. Riot squad, your sort of your SO19, your armed police. You have a bank robbery, you have major. They are the first through the door. They are in there to do the job they need to do. And the trouble is, you might have a small unit of them wandering around in their vehicle, able to jump in quickly, but you usually need to bring in a larger unit if you've got an actual big proper problem. Which actually is why I both support having smaller units of Royal Marines pre-positioned on ships around the world. I think that's a very sensible idea, but I still want to keep the LPDs or replace them with LHDs if we could, so we can actually deploy a larger formation when we need to, because you need both. If you think about a policing network, it's very much like that. You've got your bobbies on the beat. That's your present ships. Whether they are patrol ships doing, the counter-terrorism work, the fisheries protection, all these sort of things, or they are your forward deployed frigate in Bahrain, wandering up and down the Straits of Hormuz, going, just behave, okay? Just don't do it. But they are your presence. When you group a load of escorts together, that is your riot police. That's your task group, especially when they're linked in with your carrier, which is your mounted police and probably your detectives as well, if they're providing airborne early warning and anti-submarine warfare helicopters. Although your submarines could also be your detectives. The submarines would like that, going out seeing things. And then there's the minesweepers, sniffer dogs. Airborne early warning is probably similar in the Navy's use of airborne early warning, which is probably similar to actually to police helicopters. Curious enough, in the UK, both helicopters. So, it fits in. It's a whole group of different skill sets that you have to bring together. You've got your oceanographic team, which is kind of like your forensic, your forensic investigation unit. All these things have to build together, and you have different scenarios come up, and you have to tailor it. And if you are short in one area, that's a problem. If you have a small capability, you can tend to make by. You can grow it, or what you have can be, if they are worked very hard and you promise the people a lot of leave when it's over, you can cover it. If you have no capability and are relying on an ally to provide it, that's more problematic. Because sometimes the allies will come, sometimes they won't. Now, in the classic example that's used is the Falklands War to justify Britain going alone. And actually, some allies do turn up and do help. Not in terms of military power, but as direct, but in terms of logistics, support, allies. Americans are especially good for this, but other nations as well. But you also have the thing that in 1982, the perception wasn't just in Argentina that the British forces were gone and didn't matter because of successive cuts and successive weaknesses. You had a lot of allies who also felt the British weren't really there. That they might be contributing to the British army on the Rhine, but that wasn't what they associated the British with, and what they weren't, not what they were worried about. Because the British Army of the Rhine, as big as it was never as big as some of the other land forces were convinced there, but it provided a lot of good high technical capabilities and therefore was very useful. But what most nations were looking at Britain to do was about the Battle of the West Atlantic. Or the East Atlantic and the West Atlantic. Sorry, East and West getting confused a bit there. Joys of dyslexia. The East Atlantic. The battle of getting the American supplies, the Canadian reinforcements, all the other reinforcements, all the food and goods to Europe to fight the battle. That's where the Navy came in. And it had two missions to do to secure that. One of them was to secure Norway. That sounds funny. You're fighting the Battle Atlantic and one of your critical missions is to secure Norway. Well, you could say experienced World War II. You could also say the Third Shock Army sitting where it was. All these things mounted up to the fact that securing Norway was pretty darn critical. Protecting convoys required air defense as well as anti-submarine warfare. Getting Marines ashore in Norway required air defense as well as anti-submarine warfare. This is why you have escort carriers. This is why, despite in the 1967 defense paper on the decision of East of Suez, oh, we can get rid of aircraft carriers. Very quickly, governments realized you can't. But governments can't afford to admit that they were wrong. So instead of admitting they were wrong, they commissioned the through-deck cruisers and Harriers and hope those will be enough. Luckily, they were. Just. So, navies, and I don't like to wander into modern stuff too much on my channel because I prefer to do that on bilge pumps. Navies and the modern world in peacetime are your bobbies and the beat, your policemen. They're training on the world, your maritime global policemen. I know it's a dirty word, but you actually need it. No one really wants to be it, but you all have to be it for yourselves. No one wants the cost doing it. No one wants the pressure, the stress, the difficulty that comes with doing it. But the trouble is, you can't rely on anyone else to do it for you if you do not do it yourself. You have to show up to be counted. And the sea is an ungoverned entity. It covers 70% of the world's surface, and it's ungoverned. Most of the rules, most of what happens there is long distances away from anything at home, but it has big impacts. And when you have issues in the Straits of Hormuz or Malacca or Panama Canal or Suez, you have issues in the UK. Insurance is our allies. That is the defense insurance. But that insurance, the premiums you pay for your insurance are your actual defense forces. If you have the forces, you're paying the premiums for your insurance. And so you have the insurance. But if you don't, then you don't. And that's when you end up in trouble. So the moral of the story is fund your armed forces adequately. We're not talking about 10% of GDP. We're not talking, it might be 2%, it might be 3%, it might be 2.4%. It doesn't matter. You have to work out as a nation what is right for you. But also have a realistic, honest conversation about what are you losing when you cut things. Do not pretend that forward basing a small amount of troops in a small ship is the same as being able to deliver a large amount of troops with their heavy equipment where you want in the world. It isn't. Don't pretend and don't think that light and speed will compensate for everything, because there are a lot of people in this world who play computer games, and that themselves was a benefit for it. I experienced that. Because how often, and you're thinking if you're playing your strategy games, even those people without war experience, those people with war experience will notice even more. If you're a light, small, fast unit and you get pinned down, it's not a good scenario. It's far better to be a slightly more medium unit, because then you might well have the firepower that when someone tries to pin you down, you can break out and break away. Gives you more options. So, what do we have coming up? Tuesday, it's some more admirals, engineers, and historians. This is the normal history stuff I do. 16th of July, naval diplomacy. 20th of July, next Patreon video. The Royal Navy operations in the Indian Ocean from 1941 to 43. Thursday, 23rd of July, from the sea. 28th of July, making Mare Nostrum a hollow jest. And 3rd of July, pre-tribals. Cool stuff. And where else you can find me? Twitter, Patreon, and Global Maritime History. But most of my current stuff goes on SimSec and bilge pumps. Most of this stuff is history. This is what I do 90% of the time, and what infuses a lot of my writing about non-history stuff, current affairs, which also goes in things like the Warships International Fleet Review and a few other publications, if you're ever looking and see me. Take care, have a nice day, and see you later at the 50th live stream. That's the 50th proper live stream I've done since lockdown began. Hopefully I'll live up to it being the 50th. Thank you, take care, and hope this has been interesting and useful. Bye. And thank you again to all my subscribers. Thank you again to everyone who likes my videos. Thank you to everyone who just comes and watches them. Thank you. And please do like and subscribe if you haven't. And share. I like to start debates. And if they're very long comments, I tend to respond to them in the videos. Take care and have a nice day. As I said, see you later.